Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that powerful strangers had gathered in a distant city, taken out maps of your home, drawn lines across your land with rulers, and decided your future without ever setting foot in your village, without speaking your language.
Because in the late 19th century, that is exactly what happened to an entire continent.
And it began not with armies marching or cannons firing, but with pens scratching across paper in elegant European rooms filled with polished wood tables, crystal glasses, and men who believed they were dividing opportunity rather than destroying worlds.
Gentlemen, we must ensure an orderly partition of these territories. Our respective claims in the East must be respected.
Because in 1884, the great powers of Europe gathered in Berlin, not because Africa was empty, but because it was full.
Full of kingdoms, empires, trade networks, cultures, cities, farmers, warriors, and scholars, full of history stretching back thousands of years.
But in the European imagination, it was still called the Dark Continent.
And what followed would become one of the fastest and most aggressive land grabs in human history.
A geopolitical feeding frenzy that saw roughly 90% of Africa fall under European control in just a few decades.
A transformation so sudden and so violent in its consequences that even today the borders created during that era still shape conflicts, economies, and identities across the continent.
And the story begins, as many imperial stories do, with greed, fear, ambition, and competition.
Because by the late 1800s, Europe was changing rapidly. Factories were rising, machines were roaring, populations were growing. And industrial powers like Britain, France, and Germany were hungry not just for resources like rubber, cotton, copper, gold, and ivory, but also for prestige.
Because empire was not only about profit, it was about status, about proving national strength, about showing rivals that your flag flew farther across the globe than theirs.
And so Africa became less a place on the map and more a prize in a high-stakes game of international rivalry.
But the rush did not begin with governments. It began with explorers and businessmen.
Observe this peak. It had never before been seen by European eyes. Remarkable. Truly remarkable.
Men who traveled into the African interior and returned with stories that electrified European audiences.
Stories of vast rivers, powerful kingdoms, enormous wealth, and untapped resources.
And among these figures, one name stands out, a journalist turned explorer who traveled the Congo River and whose reports would inspire not only curiosity, but conquest.
Because his journeys convinced one ambitious European monarch that Africa was not just a place to explore, but a place to own.
The strength of our nation is measured not just in our triumphs, but in our willingness to sacrifice for the greater glory.
Presenting himself as a humanitarian interested in ending slavery and bringing civilization, while secretly planning one of the most exploitative colonial regimes in history. And through clever diplomacy and manipulation, he convinced European leaders that his control of the Congo would be beneficial for trade and humanitarian work. But what followed would expose the brutal reality behind the rhetoric of civilization. Because once control was secured, the Congo Free State became not a philanthropic project, but a forced labor machine, where local populations were compelled to harvest rubber under horrific conditions. And stories began to spread of villages destroyed, families torn apart, and atrocities committed in the name of profit. And yet, Leopold was only one player in a much larger race.
because as news of Africa's potential spread, European powers became increasingly nervous that if they did not act quickly, their rivals would seize the advantage.
And fear is often the greatest accelerator of imperial expansion.
This line must extend to the 14th parallel.
The Portuguese claim conflicts with the British protectorate here.
We must ensure
And this
free
fear
navigation of the
led
Congo
directly
River.
to the Berlin Conference, notably without a single African leader present.
And during these negotiations, they established principles that sounded orderly and rational, but would trigger a race to occupy Africa.
European powers rushed to plant flags, sign treaties, and establish military posts as quickly as possible, triggering expeditions into the African interior as each power tried to legitimize its claims.
Maps began to change with astonishing speed as territories were colored by competing empires. France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, and others carved territories across the continent.
In the middle of this expansion were African societies attempting diplomacy, resistance, and survival.
Some resisted with force, fighting battles against technologically superior armies. Others, like Ethiopia, proved resistance could succeed under strong leadership. But most of the continent fell under colonial rule by the early 20th century.
Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent, while the rest of Africa was divided. The borders drawn by Europeans would shape Africa's future conflicts and nations.
Yet African cultures endured, preserving traditions despite colonial control.
After World War II, independence movements began to rise. New nations were born as colonial flags were lowered. But the legacy of the scramble still remains today. A reminder of how power can reshape entire continents.
And how its consequences can last for generations. Because the scramble for Africa changed the course of history forever.
A story of ambition, conflict, resistance, and survival. And a history that still echoes into the present day. The Africa story is not just one of what was taken, but of what endured, a testament to human resilience and a reminder that history is never truly silent.
Some histories are written in books, others are written in the lives of people who survived them. Thank you for watching.